Matt, good morning. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, Arrow. How are you?
Fantastic. We got to let listeners know the name of the book, The Life We Chose. Let me tell you, dude, I feel like this is a backstage pass, a front row seat. It's almost like you're going, hey, I know a friend that knows a friend, and I'm going to share a story with you.
Yeah, it's something like that.
What is our fascination with the family? Because, I mean, even today, I mean, they have TV shows about the grandkids of the family.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're getting a peek into a world that you never see.
Right.
Particularly, from the past. We've all seen stories and heard rumors and whatnot, but now you've got a guy like Billy D'Elia, who was the actual head of the Bufalino crime family beginning in 1994. But before that, he had been the protege and so-called son of Russell Buff, who had, arguably been the most important and influential organized crime figure of the 20th century. And Billy was with him. He was at his hip for almost all of those 28 years. Even when Russell was in prison during the 1980s, Billy went to go visit him out in Leavenworth, in Kansas. So there was no one closer to Russell. So when Billy was arrested in 2006 on a money laundering charge, every law enforcement agency in the country wanted to talk to him. The New York City Terrorism Task Force, Homeland Security, Secret Service, and the FBI. The FBI wanted to talk to Billy about Hoffa because Russell had long been suspected of having a role in Hoffa's murder. And Billy wouldn't speak to anyone. He basically just kept his mouth shut. So it wasn't until 2020 when I got an email out of the blue asking if I wanted to speak to Billy. And I said, sure. That's when Billy started to talk. And, he just goes through 50 years of history we just go through one name after another, and you just see the breadth and the power of organized crime.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall the moment that you walked in and had that first sentence shared, because it's like, what do? You walk in there and say, so what do you want from me? What can I do for you?
So I had covered Billy in the early 2000s when he had gotten arrested. So when I actually first met him, we set up a meeting in a public place, in a restaurant, in a private room. And, he's 6'4". He's in his mid-70s. He's a fearsome character. He's a fearsome individual. And even though he wanted to talk to me, it really took about 3-4 months for him to get going. It was very difficult prying any information out of him. He still had that mob mentality. But he began to trust me, though, and it slowly melted away. And, within 5-6 months, we were just rolling. And we went from one place to another place to another place. And it was incredible. He's an interesting guy in that he could be very, very charming. He's a good businessman. He could probably have been successful in any other industry had he chosen it. He wasn't born into the mob like a lot of these guys are. He basically fell into it and came to love Russell Bufalino, which at its core, that's what this story is. It's a father and son story. Yeah. It's about how D'Elia ended up meeting Russell and how he ended up staying with him for the next 30 years.
I'm so glad that you talk about the growing period of him. And the reason why is because I was writing about it today, that you have these great leaders inside their families, but they had to be followers first. They had to learn from those before them in order to be the leaders that they became.
Absolutely. I mean, he would never have been the leader that he was with, if he had not been with Russell. Yeah. Russell taught him everything. I mean, there are scenes in the book early on where he meets Russell and he's his driver. He had been a participant, so to speak, later in his life with Russell, but early on he was just an observer. And, you see Russell basically teaching him the finer points of being a mob guy, how to make money. I once said to Billy, so how much did Russell pay you? Like, I'm thinking he gets a weekly check or something. He goes, I didn't get paid. No, it wasn't like that. He goes, he taught me how to make money. Yeah. How to make money on jewelry. They used to get stolen jewelry in New York, and they'd get it, and, you have guys go steal it. They bring it to Midtown Manhattan, give it to Russell, and Russell gives them the Billy, and they'd sell it. How they sold what were called overcuts, or, Russell had dress factories in Pennsylvania. how they basically, they did one so-called score after another. That's how they made money. And then they graduated into legitimate businesses. So it was an education. Basically, it was an education in crime that he got. But with that education came, an opening into a world that Billy never, ever dreamed he'd ever see, which included business leaders, entertainment icons, and of course, the most powerful organized crime figures.
Yeah. The book we're talking about is The Life We Chose. What's really interesting about the way that you unveil the authenticity of this book is the fact that we were so blindsided in the 80s and 90s by John Gotti. I mean, that's what everybody was talking about, John Gotti. And now you introduce us to Russell, and it's like, wow, I had no idea.
We have no idea, basically, because, and it's the same thing today, it's who the media focuses on.
Yep.
I mean, how is anyone going to know anything about these guys, unless they learn from it, from either radio or television, I mean, today there was so many different, you got streaming networks and whatnot, but that's what you got it. So that's what you got. So in New York and across the country, the news was about John Gotti,
yep.
The Dapper Don, where Russell's genius had always been to stay behind the scenes. So the fact that he was based in Pennsylvania, in Northeast Pennsylvania, even though he spent most of his time in New York City, even though law enforcement knew he was very powerful, he tended to kind of stay away from him and focus on the guys that would get the headlines. So, that's how guys like Russell and Billy were able to stay under the radar for so many years.
Was it still a big competition between New York and Chicago? Now let's throw in some Las Vegas, because it seems like that went away in the 60s and 70s, but I just have this gut feeling that it's now stretching down even into the Carolinas these days with the way that people are traveling.
So, organized crime or the Italian Mafia isn't what it used to be, not even close.
Yeah.
Because of the efforts of law enforcement since the 1980s and the RICO Act and whatnot. But it's still there. And yeah, I mean, cigarettes and whatnot, I'm sure they're still involved in. If there's a way to make money, there are always guys that are going to try and do it under the table. What they don't have anymore is guys like Russell, who had great influence because of his connections, let's say, to the Teamsters Union. He had been so close to Jimmy Hoffa, and Russell had placed his cousin William with Hoffa in the 1940s, and William became the general counsel. So now Russell has a direct conduit to the Teamsters. So he's also handing out loans through their Central States Pension Fund, which made him even that much more powerful. So that kind of power, I'm sure, is a thing of the past. But you'll always see organized crime at some level.
There's going to be a lot of readers that are going to take note of the headlines that have been written about you and about the book, about the Jimmy Hoffa. You've unveiled new things here. They're going to come to this book looking for the Jimmy Hoffa, but what they're going to get is a real, honest to God story. I mean, you pour yourself into these paragraphs.
Yeah. So we kind of like I said, spent a lot of time talking to Billy, and then at the end of the day, I probably used maybe 15% of what he told me, because the idea was to tell a story. I didn't want to do one fact after another fact after another fact. I wanted to tell a story, but wanted to tell a story that was, not just complex and not just, not just having that wow factor, but also was emotional. And I think, it succeeded in that. You could see the relationship budding between Bufalino and Billy, even though they're members of organized crime. You can see they had real deep affection for each other. And I think that's the beauty of the book, is the relationship between the two of them. And then you've got all this other stuff going on around them over the course of 30 years, and then another 20 after Russell dies. So, that to me was that to me, frankly, is why I wanted to do this book after talking to Billy, given I was able to tell this complex, nuanced story.
The Kennedy brothers and Russell. Wow. I did not know that this was even a possibility until I found it on your pages.
Yeah. So Russell was, I said to Billy, was Russell ever on the commission? He said, no, Russell was above the commission. And I went, wow, okay. And, you could, Russell was in Cuba.
Oh,
Organized
right,
crime blamed
right,
it.
right.
He had casinos in Cuba, and he left behind $1 million when he got chased out of there. And so the CIA learned about that and ultimately recruited Russell in these so-called CIA mafia plots. And they recruited Russell to help with their efforts to kill Castro, as well as the Bay of Pigs invasion. And they were furious. They thought that the Kennedys were going to help them recover their casinos in Cuba. And after the Bay of Pigs, that didn't happen. Before that, there had been a lot of hatred between Bufalino and Bobby Kennedy because of Bob's aggressive position, aggressive questioning during the rackets hearings of the late 1950s. They hated each other. And so, there have been a lot of innuendo and rumor about, obviously the mob's participation in the deaths of the Kennedy brothers. I will tell you one story from the book, and it occurs much later in 1981. And that is when Russell's is about to go to prison and they're trying to get a pardon for him. And they end up sending Muhammad Ali and Angelo Dundee to Washington to meet Ted Kennedy to plead for a pardon for Russell. Now, Ted Kennedy has no idea who they're there for, but when he finds out it's Russell Bufalino, he throws them both out of his office and says, "I'll never do anything for a Bufalino." So that shows you the depth of the hatred between Bufalino and
See, I've always read the stories that the Gambinos were such a part of it. I mean, once again, this goes to the media, doesn't it? I mean, the media was writing about the Gambinos, and then now I'm learning through this book that, no, this goes in a completely different direction than what we've been taught through the media.
Yeah, so Carlo Gambino was a very important figure. I mean, you can't deny that. He was. Carlo Marcello was a very important figure. Santa Traficant was a very important figure. But so was Russell Bufalino. Those guys got the media attention. Russell didn't. And that's why people, even today, are going, wait, how did this happen? Who is this guy? And so when you read the book, and it's also the beauty of this story, you're writing about two relatively unknown people, and you're reading, and for many, they're reading about them for the first time, and they're probably going, wow.
Wow, that inspires me that Russell wanted to be that guy that didn't want to be in the media, because so many times people, it's like Facebook. Everybody wants to be liked. Well, it wasn't about that. It was about running his businesses, and I find that to be very inspiring that he was that focused.
Yeah, he always said to Billy, do things quietly, do not dress flashy. Don't get, we did all of these interviews for well over a year and a half in the old home that Russell Bufalino lived in. When he died in 94, his wife died in 2006. She left the house to Billy's son, who they named Russell. And so we ended up, and it's a ranch home. It's nice, but it's not what you'd expect a mob boss to own. It's not a Tony Soprano house. And that's what, that was the lesson that Russell gave to Billy. And Billy had lived and still to this day lives in a very quiet street in Northeast Pennsylvania. And, he had wanted to move to a much bigger house. And then he thought about it and said, no, and he stayed where he is. And so you would never, ever, ever think that this was the home to a mafia don. Wow. But that was the important lesson that Russell Bufalino had drilled into him.
I was shocked to see Michael Jackson's name brought up in this book.
So that's a great story in that Donald Trump wanted Jackson to play his casino in Atlantic City in 1988, and Jackson's manager was Frank DeLeo. And DeLeo, people would know him from the movie Goodfellas. He played the cab stand owner, Tookie. He was really a music executive. But DeLeo said no. So what Trump does is he had mob connections himself, and he actually knew Billy D'Elia, as I write in the book. But he reaches out to two mob guys on the West Coast, and they try to strong arm D'Elia. And they tell him that Jackson's going to play the casino because Trump's going to give them $1 million to do this. And so D'Elia reaches out to friends in the East Coast, and they bring Billy in. And there's this big meeting in New York during the Grammys in 1988, and Billy's there. And when these two mob guys show up, they recognize Billy, and they knew that, the gig was up. And they beg Billy to let this happen. They say they'll share half the Trump money, and Billy says no. They leave. D'Elia is thrilled, but Frank D'Elia, the manager, is thrilled. But Billy D'Elia tells him, nope, this isn't over yet. I'm now your partner. So now he's now Michael Jackson's co-manager, and he ends up touring with Jackson that summer during the Bad Tour. And he actually spent a lot of time with Michael, and that's in the book, a lot of these conversations that have taken place with Michael and Billy's dislike for Michael's father and how he met the rest of the family. And so it's really fascinating. But to see how he came about to be, the co-manager of one of the great music icons ever, is a really fascinating story.
Wow. The book we're talking about is The Life We Chose. Labor, political corruption, money laundering, murder. I mean, this sounds like today. And are we really staring down the eyes of a new Teflon Don? And I hope that hopefully that didn't cross any lines by bringing that up.
No, in terms of what, Billy?
No, in terms of you mentioned Donald Trump, and because I'm sorry. I've always felt that this he's the new Teflon Don.
It's funny because there have been some stories about the book that have broken this weekend about Trump and being associated with Billy in the 80s and 1990s. They met when Billy was the head of the Bufalino family. He spent a lot of time in Atlantic City, and he met with Trump. He had known him, and he met with him a couple of times, and they talked over business deals. One was to do phone cards that they had at the time, and another one was timeshare deal where Billy, when you do timeshare meetings, you give away gifts to people that come, and Trump wanted one of the gifts to be his book, The Art of the Deal. Mm-hmm. And Billy would have had to buy like 10,000 copies of the book, which for Trump would have rocketed his book up the bestseller charts. So Billy said no to both. He didn't want to spend the money. But the fact that, he would actually meet with the head of a major crime family in person and demand cash under the table, it's kind of reckless, I think. But it gives you great insight into someone like a Donald Trump who likes to do things on his own. So, but I'm not sure if, we're so polarized today. You got half the country's going to ignore it, and you got the other half of the country that might jump all over it. But I'm not sure what kind of legs it's going to have. And you could be right. I mean, I know people that have read it already that are Trump fans, and they go, "Okay, so what? They owe me." And I'm like, okay, I don't have an opinion on it one way or the other. I'm a longtime journalist, and I'm an independent, so. But it's just fascinating to see people that are, big time Trump fans, and it just means nothing to them that he had meetings or knew the head of a organized crime family.
I've been educated by Hollywood as well as the media. At any time as this journalist that you are, and you're so great at it, were you ever accused of being a wise guy? How do I know you're not a wise guy, that you're not going to take this information and give it to somebody else?
Oh, no, I did. I was once accused of being a spy, though, for law enforcement. When I did I did the Quiet Dawn in 2013 about Bufalino. I was sued by an inmate in prison who claimed I was a tool of the government. So I don't know. No, I wasn't. I wasn't. No, I've never been. I'm not a mob writer. I just happened to have. I did the book Deconstructing Sammy in 2008. Which, unfortunately for Sammy, he did a lot of business with the mob.
Yeah.
And it had a great effect on his life. I ended up covering Billy D'Elia in the early 2000s, which led to my 2013 book, The Quiet Dawn. But in doing that book, I didn't really have a great source. It was all documents and whatnot. I have the ultimate source now. So I had no plans, no desire to do another mob book until Billy reached out to me, and I knew what that meant. I knew he had never spoken to anyone, and I knew he was going to unlock many, many secrets, and I just couldn't pass it up. And, I'm glad I didn't.
As a journalist, how do you face the fear factor? I mean, we all have confidence that we can go in and grab a great conversation, but we still have that element of fear somewhere inside of us.
I wasn't, when they first emailed me and I went to meet Billy, we met at a restaurant first, but then when I went to the Bufalino house, for a few weeks, I kept looking behind me. I still couldn't wrap it around my head that Billy wanted to talk. I'm thinking to myself, maybe he's upset with something I wrote in The Quiet Dawn. So, I would tell my wife when I arrived, hey, I'm here now, So, it happened for the first couple of weeks. After that, listen, you just, any reporter would do this. You just go and you follow the story and you write about it, because that's what you do.
Wow. The name of the book, The Life We Chose. Man, Matt, you got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me
Well,
on.
you be brilliant today, okay, sir?
You too.